cold night at RAF Gravelly in Cambridgeshire. By midnight, the old rule that fog shuts a bomber station no longer worked. The reason fit inside a steel burner nozzle running the length of a concrete strip. In 10 minutes, the runway appeared as a bright canyon through gray air, and 4 Halifax crews came home, who otherwise would have circled to fuel exhaustion. The burning fog trick changed recovery math across 15 stations. Subscribe, new Evidence First World War II videos every day. The clock on the Cambridgeshire Operations Board showed the 19th of November, 1943, just after 22:30. RAF Gravelly sat west of the Great North Road and south of the River Ouse, a Pathfinder base under Bomber Command. Freezing fog had sunk into the fields by late afternoon, and visibility along the main strip was barely 100 yards. The old rule here was brutal and simple. If the fog stayed, heavy aircraft did not land. Crews diverted, or they waited until fuel ran out. On that night, a new system broke the rule. Petroleum pumps sent petrol through buried pipes to burner rails set along both sides of the runway. Men on the ground lit the lines section by section, each length catching with a deep whoosh and a low roar. Within 10 minutes, the heat raised a clear lane, and the fog sheared upward in a moving wall. The first landings followed. 4 Halifax bombers recovered in a window that had not existed a quarter hour earlier. The surprise mechanic was not light, but heat and flow. The burners created a thermal plume down the strip, a river of rising air that dragged moisture upward and mixed the cold layer with warmer air above. Unlike floodlights, which only dazzled crews in haze, the plume changed the air itself. In test notes later filed, controllers wrote that runway visibility rose from about 100 yards to about 2 miles in roughly 10 minutes of continuous burn. The strip became a measured corridor, not a guess. One hard metric defined the cost and the power, about 100,000 gallons per hour of petrol when a full installation ran. Bomber Command accepted the figure because the alternative was worse, measured in aircraft lost and crews missing. Operations room plots from 1943 and 1944 show recovery waves stacking over the Wash and the Lincolnshire Fens, while station engineers signaled FIDO lit and FIDO off in chalk. Those short burns matched the fuel balance of returning heavies down to the minutiae. Gravelly was not alone. That winter, only 3 stations had the full system ready for use: Gravelly in Cambridgeshire, Downham Market in Norfolk, and Fiskerton near Lincoln. Each lay on the bomber lanes that led back from Germany across the Humber and the Wash. Each sat near railheads able to feed tanks and pump houses with bulk fuel. The map pins formed a ladder of last chances. The old rule had rested on physics and experience. Ground fog pooled under clear skies and light winds, often thickest in the last hour before dawn. Crews used beams, flares, and chants. Diversions carried risk as fuel ran down, and weather varied across only a few miles. At many fields, a single mile of visibility could drop to a few hundred yards in minutes, turning pattern calls into blind orbits. Controllers knew the pattern and wrote it into standing orders. FIDO erased that assumption with fire and flow. Witness objects from that month make the change plain. An Imperial War Museum's photo sequence shows flames tracking along a runway edge as a Lancaster accelerates through haze. The caption notes Dietz lamps used for ignition and the burner pipe sunk beside the concrete. A Bomber Command air diagram at the RAF Museum shows the installation as a network: tanks, pumps, main, and burner branches. A station production tally lists delivered petrol by rail wagon, count for nights when fog was forecast, then crossed out when a warm front arrived. In each case, the paperwork matches the glow seen for miles. A logistics and training vignette sits in the station diary at Downham Market. The first fit covered only the touchdown zone and the first 700 yards. Crews were briefed to aim for the lit threshold and stay on the center line. Burner models changed across the winter, from early Hagel rails to later patterns that kept flames stable in crosswinds. Ground parties drilled a simple routine: purge, prime, ignite, and stand clear until pressure settled. Each step kept the line running for the 10 to 20 minute window controllers required. Terrain and conditions mattered. On fields near rivers and drains cut through fen country, cold air pooled fast after sunset. The system worked best under radiation fog with winds below moderate levels and a firm surface wind aligned with the main. On advection fog off the North Sea, the plume needed longer burns and closer coordination with approach controllers. Even then, a lit trench in a hot plume beat a dark circuit, and a dead reckoning turn over a blacked-out village. Myth versus evidence also appears in later retellings. Stories claim pilots landed by the light of the flames, as if the system were a giant torch. The evidence says the opposite. The heat column was the key, and the light was a byproduct. Air diagrams, station orders, and engineering notes all state that visibility gains came from lifting the saturated layer and creating turbulent mixing above the strip. The runway lights stayed on low. The plume did the work. By spring of 1944, the idea had moved from a field fix to doctrine. 15 British stations took the system, including the 3 coastal emergency landing grounds with extra-wide concrete at Woodbridge, Carnaby, and Manston. The change showed in sortie recovery rates and post-strike survival. Controllers counted inbound streams not as a loss line on a chalkboard, but as a sequence of recoveries inside a corridor of heated air, 10 or 20 aircraft at a time. The old rule broke and did not return. The order path began in London in late 1942. Winston Churchill tasked the Petroleum Warfare Department to find a way to clear fog from runways, and he passed the job through Geoffrey Lloyd, the minister responsible for that wartime office. Lloyd turned to Arthur Hartley, a civil engineer on loan from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company who had already moved fuel and fire in unorthodox ways. Hartley and his small team looked at what made fog hold to a runway and what could pry it loose. They settled on heat, scale, and speed. From Whitehall, the order moved north and east to airfields, where Bomber Command fought weather as much as flak. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris needed a recovery tool. His losses in the winter months rose when fog closed bases after night raids. Hartley's group at the Petroleum Warfare Department worked with station engineers and oil company technicians from Shell to prototype a trench and burner rail that could be fed from tanks and pushed by high-capacity pumps. The design work took months rather than weeks, but the pressure of the Berlin campaign kept the schedule hard. The first operational lighting at Gravely in November 1943 showed the chain could act fast. Names, units, and signatures appear on the witness objects. A Petroleum Warfare Department memo assigns pump curves and pipe diameters to meet flow at a set pressure, with a margin for degraded filters. An RAF museum air diagram stamps FIDO across a runway plan and includes a small table of fuel draw per minute for each burner bank. An Imperial War Museum's caption describes Dietz lamps sunk flush to the turf for ignition safety. Each paper trail ends in a single action, a controller authorizing light the line and a ground crew chief acknowledging from the burner rail. Obstacles were immediate and plain. Petrol use at full draw ran to about 100,000 gallons in 1 hour, far beyond what a single station kept in ready tanks for vehicles and aircraft priming. Bulk storage had to move in by rail, then cross-feed to airfield tanks by pipe or tanker lorry. Training also lagged. Fire parties needed drills to prime, ignite, and keep the line stable in wind, and pilots needed fresh approach briefings for a lit strip with a dense heat shimmer. The system only made sense if the whole chain held together for 15 safe minutes. The supply line bent to meet the demand. At several stations, rail sidings were assigned for fuel trains on days when forecasts warned of radiation fog. Duty engineers wrote wagon counts next to their Met records. At Metheringham, a FIDO-related rail spur and pump house became fixed features of the technical site, serving number 106 Squadron and later a bomber defense training flight. Overnight, airfield maps gained new symbols for tanks, manifolds, and burner trenches. The air war absorbed a civil engineering project and treated it like another weapon. Training adapted as well. Night flying programs added circuits over the lit strip so crews could read the shimmer and the crosswind drift without over-controlling. Controllers rehearsed the timing between lighting the line and releasing the first inbound from a stack. Ground crews carried maintenance cards for burner sections and learned to swap out clogged jets under blackout conditions. The handover from prototype to routine happened fast because winter pressure left no choice. The decision point came when Bomber Command weighed fuel cost against lives and aircraft. A single Lancaster and crew represented months of training and a full production chain from factories in Lancashire to sub-assemblies in Yorkshire. Station returns showed that in the fog months of 1943 and 1944, the system allowed hundreds of recoveries that would have failed under the old rule. Headquarters added the 3 coastal emergency landing grounds with extra-wide 9,000-foot by 450-foot runways, so crippled bombers could find England and stop on a first try. The network now pulled crews home from over the North Sea. Hartley's role did not stop at the drawing board. As technical director at the Petroleum Warfare Department, he signed off on burner patterns, pump specs, and installation schedules. Shell support teams provided technical notes and field fixes as stations discovered how crosswinds, slope, and nearby hedgerows changed local flow. The inventor sat inside a wartime system that could source pipe, valve, and tank at pace, the same system that later laid the Pluto fuel lines under the channel. The paper trail ties FIDO to a specific human lever and a specific office. By September of 1944, expansion orders named 15 FIDO stations across Britain, most of them on bomber lanes. Woodbridge opened first among the coastal trio in November of 1943. Carnaby and Manston followed the same emergency layout. At the inland fields, Downham Market extended its burner coverage beyond the first 700 yards, and stations in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire added complete rails. The work never fully paused. Each fog forecast forced another drill and another fuel convoy. The network matured under pressure. The final authorizations made the intent clear. Controllers were told to use the system whenever recovery windows were tight and stacks were heavy, and to report burns to the Air Ministry because of the cost. In the following 2 winters, the files show numbers hard to ignore. Roughly 2,500 aircraft saved and about 10,000 aircrew lives preserved across the network. Those counts, logged against dates between 1943 and 1945, locked the decision into doctrine. The risk and the fuel bill were accepted because the crews came home. The system broke into 3 parts a station engineer could draw on a single page. Storage tanks sat near a rail spur or protected service road, sized for repeated short burns on several nights in a week. A pump house fed a main pipe with branch valves to each burner bank, with gauges to hold pressure within a narrow band. The burner rails ran in shallow trenches along the runway edges, each section pierced with small jets that produced a low sheet of flame a few feet high. Ignition lamps or pilot burners lit the first section, the rest caught in sequence. Operators followed a steady routine. When fog met the forecast criteria and inbound streams piled up over the wash, the controller ordered a light-up. Crews on the ground purged the lines, primed the jets, and started the pumps to their set pressure. As each bank stabilized, the flame sheet grew steady and the plume rose. The approach controller judged the interval until the first landings. On the best nights, that window was near 10 minutes from ignition to safe threshold crossing. Fuel burned fast because the job was to move air, not just make light. At full draw across a long runway, the consumption rate could reach about 100,000 gallons in 1 hour. Stations managed this by burning in short pulses tied to inbound waves and by segmenting rails so not every section ran at once. Rail and road manifests from fog weeks show fuel trains arriving in the afternoon and tanker lorries topping off the on-site tanks by dusk. The numbers look high until set next to a page of losses from a single bad night in winter. The physics sat in the boundary layer. The flame front heated the air over the concrete and turf, which rose in a buoyant plume that dragged saturated air with it. That rising column increased turbulent mixing near the surface and reduced relative humidity across the strip. The visible effect was a widening slot with clear runway lights and markings. Technical papers on warm fog dispersal list thermal methods among the few techniques that work fast enough for operations when wind is light and the fog is radiative rather than advective. That matched the British winter pattern inland from the coasts. Witness objects pin down the method. The RAF Museum air diagram labels burner, pump, and storage with flow arrows and a note on draw per minute. An Imperial War Museum's photograph shows an Avro Lancaster using a lit strip as the haze lifts. The caption mentions Dietz ignition lamps and rails close to the concrete. An aviation trail station history describes Mk3 and later Mk4 Haygill burners at Downham Market with early coverage limited to the first 700 yards before the full rail went in. Together, the documents show a practical system refined by use. Two constraints framed every decision. Crosswinds above modest levels could bend the plume away from the center line, leaving one side of the runway clearer than the other and adding drift on short final. Advection fog off the North Sea carried moisture in depth and needed longer burns or could refuse to lift fully, especially at coastal fields like Manston. Controllers learned to time burns to lulls and to stack aircraft so only a few made the first run through marginal conditions. Inland, radiation fog under calm skies remained the ideal target for the system. Units and places anchor the method in use. At Carnaby in Yorkshire, the emergency landing ground combined a single extra-wide runway with the burner rails so battle-damaged bombers could land from the coast with minimal maneuvering. At Woodbridge in Suffolk and Manston in Kent, similar geometry met returning streams as they crossed the shoreline after raids to the Ruhr or Berlin. Inland, fields like Gravely, Fiskerton, and Metheringham used full rails to catch their own squadrons and diversions from neighbors. The network placed heat where streams converged. Reliability and practice came from redundancy rather than perfection. Stations built duplicate pump sets so a single failure did not darken the whole strip. Burner rails divided into sections with isolation valves, so a clogged jet or a damaged length could be taken off while the rest ran. Maintenance cards show routine nozzle cleaning and pressure checks after each burn. In pilot debriefs, the language is plain. When lit under the right fog type, the strip cleared enough for a safe approach most of the time. When lit under the wrong fog type, visibility improved but not always to landing minima. The method asked operators to know their field and their night. A short logistics and training vignette shows how the pieces met the clock. Afternoon met briefings flagged likely fog with wind under a set limit and a temperature dew point spread within a small band. Rail wagons offloaded into storage before dusk. Tanker lorries topped up the day tanks. Fire parties walked the rails with lamps and spares, then stood by at the pump house. In the tower, the controller kept a chalk line of inbound heights and fuel states. When the first stream called the beacon and declared low fuel, the order went out, the rails lit, and the first pair turned base within minutes. Myth versus evidence sits in the last paragraph. Some later accounts say, Fido burned off fog as if the flames consumed water. The evidence does not support that claim. The thermal method lifted and mixed the saturated layer. It did not evaporate all the water in the air mass over an airfield. Air diagrams, engineering notes, and later fog dispersion studies tie the effect to buoyancy and turbulence, not combustion of moisture. What the system burned was petrol. What it moved was air. The first clear field test sat on the Cambridgeshire map at RAF Gravely on the 19th of November, 1943. Visibility on the strip had fallen to roughly 100 yards, and the diversion plan would have pushed returning heavies into stacks over the wash until fuel ran out. Controllers lit the burner rails and watched the gray lift into a shallow arch above the concrete. In about 10 minutes, the runway opened to the equivalent of 2 miles and 4 Halifax crews landed in sequence while the pumps held pressure. The official retell from a fuel partner later kept the numbers plain and the place named, and it matches the station storyboards for that week. A witness object fixes that night in more than memory. The RAF Museum air diagrams sheet titled Fog Dispersal shows the Gravely-type layout as tanks, pumps, mains, and twin burner lines, with a single line stating a draw of about 100,000 gallons in 1 hour for a full burn. That diagram and a Pathfinder operations map are the quiet paper proof that the engineering was ready before the call came from flying control. The air diagram also lists the network size by the next year. 15 British stations, plus installations in the United States and the Aleutian Islands. The paper did not glow like the rails, but it carried the rule change into doctrine. A logistics vignette sits in a lean entry from the Pathfinder's own archive after the long Berlin leg on the 16th to 17th of December, 1943. RAF Bourne to the west of Cambridge was clamped by dense fog. The best options were the new burner strips, but at that date, only 3 fields had Fido. Gravely 6 miles to the northwest, Downham Market about 35 miles to the northeast, and Fiskerton near Lincoln about 95 miles farther. Diversion plots sent aircraft toward those 3 pins, while fire parties primed pumps and lamps. An operations note later recorded that some crashes near Gravely came when the burners were not lit early enough. The system saved many, but timing and fuel state still ruled the edge. Case 1. Defense holds. On that Berlin raid return, Gravely's rails burned the touchdown zone first, then the departure end, making a 700-yard window that expanded as flow stabilized. The Pathfinder station diary shows the window was long enough to bring in a handful of heavies with fuel warnings, and the photographs in the Imperial War Museum's Series CH15271 capture a Lancaster framed between flame sheets as haze lifts. The measurable effect was simple: landings in a fog band that would have forced a wave into the dark. The object is a photograph with a caption line. The number is 4 safe recoveries on the first operational night, and many more through winter. Case 2. Weather edge at a choke point. The Suffolk coast field at Woodbridge opened on the 15th of November, 1943, as the first of 3 emergency landing grounds built for bombers too damaged to handle narrow strips. The runway ran roughly 9,000 feet by 750 feet, divided into lanes, and the fuel rails gave an east coast gate for streams crossing the shoreline with low fuel and hydraulic faults. By the end of the war, about 4,200 emergency landings had used Woodbridge. Many came in fog that would have masked a normal field. The witness objects are an Imperial War Museum's aerial, a local history ledger, and a station narrative that repeats the count and the date. A terrain constraints note sits with Woodbridge as well. Sea fog off the North Sea did not behave like calm inland radiation fog over the Ouse or Trent. The advection layer had depth and needed longer burns. Controllers learned to light early, to add minutes to stabilize the plume, and to leave the outer lane clear for unannounced distressed aircraft. The strip's width forgave small crosswind bends in the plume, and the fuel draw moved into the afternoon rail wagon schedule. The large coastal geometry made a thermal method work at the edge of its envelope. Case 3, doctrine pivot at wing level, Carnaby in Yorkshire, Manston in Kent, and Woodbridge in Suffolk formed a 3-pin belt of emergency runways, each tied to burner rails and a tower drilled to call "Light the Line" as soon as coast-crossing streams flashed the beacons. At Manston on the 21st of September, 1944, the station used FIDO to assist 19 landings in poor visibility, a routine day for a system that had become a recovery plan rather than a risky experiment. The measure here is not one runway length, but a wing's worth of lives and machines, recovered so the bombing tempo could continue the next night. The object is the station's log note and the map print that set the belt as a doctrinal tool for bomber command. A training vignette runs through Metheringham in Lincolnshire, where installation completed in January of 1944 for number 106 Squadrons Lancasters. Crews practiced approaches over a lit strip to learn the shimmer and the drift, and fire parties drilled a purge prime ignite cycle under blackout. The local archive index lists log books and a station record book as the paper spine for those drills. The count on one cold night shows how process beat weather. 1 burn, about 15 minutes of full flow, 6 landings inside a tight window. Myth versus evidence stated at case scale. Later retells say crews landed by the light alone as if the flames were simply giant flares. The museum diagram and the Pathfinder notes say otherwise. The heat column lifted and mixed the saturated layer. The light only showed the edges of the corridor that the plume created. The rails were not theater, they were a thermal machine. The object is the air diagram. The number is 100,000 gallons an hour as the price to move air fast enough to matter. A final field test looks outward from Britain. The RAF Museum notes installations in the United States and in the Aleutian Islands where fog and low wind ruled many mornings. Those distant fits confirm the rule that the method worked best when winds were low and the fog was near the ground, not when a deep marine layer pushed inland. The spread of sites shows that the technique did not depend on one coastline or one unit badge. The witness object is the museum text itself. The measure is 15 British stations plus foreign fits across the years 1943 to 1945. The opponent's first adaptation was simple patience. German night fighter controllers had long learned to gamble on British weather, expecting that winter ground fog in Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire, and Suffolk would close main runways after a long raid. If airfields stayed dark, the last tank of fuel and the last minute on instruments would do the killing far from any flak belt. Fido undercut that bet by opening controlled corridors on order and turning diversions into timed landings. The visible flame strips also forced a second-order rethink. Intruder raids might try to home on the glow, but by late 1944, German intruder capability over England had faded, and British night fighter screens and lights-out orders limited that threat. The first hard limit was fuel, stated in plain numbers on every engineering sheet. A full installation could draw about 100,000 gallons in 1 hour. Even when burned in pulses tied to inbound waves, a station burned tens of thousands of gallons on a bad night. Rail and road support had to keep pace, and storage tanks had to be large and bunded. This cost did not appear as a simple price in pounds on a paper invoice in the open record, but it weighed on transport schedules and depot tallies. The RAF Museum's figure is the sober anchor for that scale. The second limit was weather type. Radiation fog under calm conditions over fields near the Ouse, the Witham, and the Angstholm responded well to a long, narrow heat source, advection. Fog rolling off the North Sea into Manston or Woodbridge had depth and momentum. It could thin but not vanish, and crosswinds could bend the plume away from the center line. Controllers learned to light early and to accept partial gains as sufficient if the runway lights and markings became visible inside the near threshold. Station logs from the coastal belt tell the difference between the easy nights and the stubborn ones. A third limit came from timing errors under pressure. The Pathfinder's archive entry on the 16th to 17th of December 1943 shows that late lighting and extreme fog turned a clever system into a lane of false hope, with crashes near Gravely when speed and distance left no margin. The lesson became procedure. Light before the stack compresses and hold a steady pressure before clearing the first pair to land. That winter memo sits like a warning label on the burner rail map. When obeyed, the rule kept the system in the safe band. When missed, the clock punished the whole pattern. Refinements met those three limits in steady steps. Pumps improved from early sets to robust Sulzer units, capable of holding pressure with cleaner starts. Photographs from Gravely show the industrial heart under blast-proof housings. Burner hardware matured from early rails to Mk3 and Mk4 Hagel burners, which kept a steady sheet of flame in light crosswinds and used jets that were easier to clean with a blackout kit. Segmenting the rail into shorter blocks let controllers heat the touchdown zone first and then extend heat down the strip as traffic allowed. The operating method shifted from one grand light-up to timed sectional burns. A training tweak arrived with Metheringham's January 1944 installation for No. 106 Squadron. Crews flew day circuits over a lit line to study mirage and drift without the stress of a return from Germany. Fire parties carried maintenance cards with checkboxes for purge, prime, ignition, jet cleaning, and pressure reading, so night crews could swap a clogged jet section in minutes. The tweak sounds small, but this is how a prototype became a routine. The archive index at Metheringham lists logbooks and a station record that show the drill as a standing item. A route change at the theater scale worked with the belt of emergency runways. Bomber command streams returning from the Ruhr and Berlin were nudged to cross the coast near Suffolk and Kent when forecasts warned of inland fog. That geometry put Woodbridge and Manston under stacks where rails and width could accept cripples at once, then push the rest inland to Carnaby or to Fido-equipped bases in Lincolnshire. The map pins did not just receive aircraft, they shaped the route miles before a crew saw the beacons. The IWM aerial of Woodbridge and the RAF museum diagram are the paired objects for that change. A myth versus evidence beat answers a persistent claim about burning the fog. The shell and museum lines are careful. The heat lifted and mixed the fog, creating a corridor where runway lights and paint appeared. The system did not consume water in the air. It consumed petrol to move air through buoyancy and turbulence. Photographs that show bright flame do not show the invisible mixing that did the work. The evidence is textual and technical, not just visual. A quiet cost sits in the background of every successful night. Fuel trains queued at sidings near Downham Market and Metheringham. Tanker lorries wore out tires on rough perimeter tracks. Pump crews finished shifts smelling of petrol and heat. A handful of burner sections suffered flashback or jet clog, and maintenance teams swapped them by torchlight in freezing air. No enemy was needed to exhaust a station that ran the rails 3 times in one fog week. The burden shows in transport manifests and maintenance cards more than in headline counts. The final refinement was scale. By September of 1944, the British network stood at about 15 stations, with the coastal trio of Woodbridge, Carnaby, and Manston forming a doctrine in themselves. Controllers issued standard messages, and pilots received standard approach briefs for lit rails. The network effect is why the RAF Museum can write a single line that sums the lives saved and the sorties recovered across 2 winters. The adaptation had been met, the limits managed, and the method refined into a system. Immediate outcomes are written in numbers that outlast anecdotes. Between 1943 and 1945, roughly 2,500 aircraft landed safely in fog on burner-equipped runways in Britain, and the museum tally links those landings to about 10,000 aircrew lives preserved. Those numbers speak to post-strike survival as much as to engineering pride. A bomber back on concrete meant a crew available for the next night and a machine returned to the line. This is what sortie recovery rate looks like when written in ledgers rather than in adjectives. The RAF Museum places those figures on a single page with the design sketch and the date span. Operational tempo changed with the network in place. Winter weather no longer dictated a stand-down when the forecast showed calm nights and high humidity over the fens and valleys of Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. Controllers knew that, with fuel in the tanks and crews at the rails, recovery windows of 10 to 20 minutes could be manufactured on demand. Inland fields like Gravelly and Fiskerton and coastal belts like Woodbridge and Manston held their own traffic and accepted diversions when neighbors clamped. That shift is why the museum text goes further and states that the system helped shorten the war by keeping operations going when weather said stop. A logistics and training vignette closes the loop. At Downham Market, a surviving photograph shows the remains of a Fido installation set beside an old service road. The caption names the field as the second to receive the system. For 2 winters, rail wagons brought fuel to local sidings and tanker lorries pushed loads to bunded storage by late afternoon when fog was forecast. Fire parties briefed ignition sequences and pressure set points, and flying control rehearsed their clock from light the line to clear to land. The quiet triumph here is that a bomber station learned to treat weather like an adversary it could time and outmaneuver. The coastal belt left its own tally. Woodbridge's ledger, repeated in station histories, counts about 4,200 emergency landings by the end of the war. Not every one of those landings used the rails, but a large share came in bad weather and a hard fraction came in fog that would have hidden a normal runway. At Manston, a station day book entry notes 19 landings assisted by Fido on the 21st of September, 1944. Carnaby's case files tell a similar story in fewer lines, because a very wide runway and rails were a simple combination to brief. Together, the 3 formed an East Coast promise. If a crew crossed the shoreline with minutes of fuel and a damaged hydraulic line, a strip wide enough and hot enough was waiting. The long tail of the method reached into post-war research and training. Woodbridge hosted the Blind Landing Experimental Unit, which pushed instrument and approach systems so crews could fly to lower minima without flames. Those trials sat beside the memory of winter rails and made a bridge from thermal dispersal to instrument landing systems that would carry civil and military traffic in peacetime. The British choice to remove the last burner installation at Manston in 1959 did not erase the lesson. It marked a handover from heat-made corridors to radio and later radar-guided minima. The airfield files record both eras on the same map grid. Doctrine also traveled. The museum text notes American and Aleutian installations, where low winds and frequent fog made the physics favorable. In those theaters, the same constraints applied. Fuel had to be present in depth, burner rails had to be kept clean, and crosswinds had to be watched. The lesson repeated. Where fog was shallow and stable, heat and flow could make a lane. Where fog was deep and driven by sea wind, the lane narrowed and time burned fast. Even there, the method bought minutes that a fuel gauge could not offer. A myth versus evidence note belongs in the aftermath as well. Later popular accounts still describe a giant flare path as the main effect, and a few museum captions lean into the spectacle. Yet the engineering notes in the RAF diagram point to the thermal plume as the central actor. Heat lifted and mixed the saturated air so the existing low-intensity runway lights and paint could be seen. The light was a guide. The physics was the cure. The photograph of a Lancaster landing between flames is proof of use, not proof of mechanism. Costs and limits did not vanish with success. The price was counted in railwagon numbers and storage tank levels, not in simple currency lines open to public view. Fire risk, jet clogging, and pump wear stayed on maintenance cards through the winters of 1943 to 1945. Crosswinds and advection fog still cut corridors thinner than controllers liked on parts of the East Coast. The system's legacy is not that it removed weather, but that it taught operators to move the edge of a weather rule for just long enough. The final outcome sits back at Gravely, where the winter haze once closed the strip by late afternoon. On a night in May of 1945, an Avro Lancaster of number 35 squadron took off with rails lit on either side, the flames low and steady under a lifting layer as a station photographer worked a long exposure. That image, filed as CH15271, connects the first brutal fog season to the last months of the war, and it shows a base that had learned to write its own corridor in air. The numbers on the museum page give the scale. The picture gives the shape. The old rule was not destroyed. It was timed, managed, and bent. A last stillness closes the map pin. The rails are gone, the tanks pulled, and the bund walls flattened. At Manston, the last hardware left in 1959, and grass grew where the burner lines once ran. But on winter nights in Cambridgeshire and Suffolk, fog still pools over the old concrete and drains. The difference is that the story of those rails turned into procedures and instruments that keep crews on a line, and the paper trail in museums keeps the numbers honest.